Welcome to Shootin Straight. I'm your host, Ken Buck. In today's highly partisan environment, political adversaries often minimize each other's arguments by labeling motives rather than engaging in constructive dialogue. For the next 30 minutes or so, I invite you to join me as we learn about Hans von Spakovsky and how he became one of the nation's preeminent experts on election integrity. Many of us know Hans for his writings on the topic of election security. We will learn how Hans's incredible life story and his parents' escape from two totalitarian regimes influenced his view of elections and our civic duties. It is my pleasure to welcome Hans von Spakovsky to the show. Are you ready to start shooting straight?
I sure am, Ken. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So how did you develop this passion for election integrity?
Well, it was a combination of my family background, stories I heard from my parents and what they had experienced, plus my own personal experiences, not only in being an exchange student early in my life while I was still in high school, but then some of the personal experiences I had when I was a practicing lawyer. And for the first time I went, for example, and became a poll watcher in an election down in Atlanta, Georgia.
Great. Well, let's start with your parents.
Sure.
Fascinating story of your parents and where they came from and how they ended up in America. Let's start with your dad. Tell us about your dad.
Sure. Well, folks hear my name, Hans von Spakovsky, and they think he must be from somewhere in Europe. And no, I was born and raised in Alabama, but my parents were immigrants. I'm first generation. My father was Russian. He was much older than my mother when he married her, although they then had 5 kids. But my father actually was born in St. Petersburg when it was still St. Petersburg. And he, as a very young man, fought in the Russian Revolution as a white army officer against the communists. At the end of the war, when the communists took over, he was fortunate enough to escape. Went to Yugoslavia, settled there, went back to college, got his degrees, ended up as a professor teaching in Yugoslavia. And then in 1946, unfortunately, when Tito and the communists started taking over in Yugoslavia, he had to flee again. He literally got a phone call from a friend of his who was an Anglican priest who said, "Your name's on a list." Because what Tito was doing was they were arresting anyone who they thought would oppose them. And because my father had been a white Russian who had fought the communists, they were going to arrest him. And the people they arrested either ended up in prison or were killed. So he packed a bag, walked out of his house, left everything he owned behind, and he headed for what he figured would be the safest place in Europe, where there were American troops. And he ended up in the American-occupied sector of Germany, where he met my mother in a refugee camp, where she had also ended up.
How did your mother get to that refugee camp?
Well, my mother grew up in a town called Breslau, Germany. She unfortunately lived through the Nazi regime during World War II. All of the German civilians at the end of the war were forced out of Breslau by Russian troops. She was fortunate enough to go west. A lot of those civilians were forced to go east, where they disappeared into Joseph Stalin's slave labor camps and factories. And so she and my grandmother and my mother's sisters all ended up in this refugee camp in southern Germany.
And she met your father in the refugee camp?
Yeah, he had gotten a job there actually as a translator, because like a lot of Europeans of that time period, he spoke a number of languages, including Russian, French, German, Serbian, and English. And so they used him as a translator with the other refugees.
Interesting. Did your mother have any interaction with the Nazis when she was living
when
in
she was 16, this is right at the end of the war, she was actually arrested by the Gestapo because she had ventured into a part of the town she was living in that had been declared off limits, trying to find her grandparents. And so she was arrested by the Gestapo. I mean, fortunately, she survived that. But her experiences during the war were very traumatic.
Your parents lived in Alabama. You
Right.
Grew up in Alabama. Tell us about the experience. What were they doing at the time, and what sort of values did they really pass on to you?
Yeah, my father was fortunate. He had gotten a job at a small college in North Alabama, Jacksonville State College at the time. My mother also worked there in the administration. And so that's how I ended up being born in Alabama. And look, I had a very typical American childhood. You know, I had lots of friends. I played baseball in school. But when I would come home at night and we would be sitting at the dinner table, often I would hear stories from my parents about what it was like living in a dictatorship and how lucky we were to be growing up in the United States. And I learned from them, one, that your liberty and freedoms can be lost very quickly. And second, and this is a phrase many have heard before, my father really believed in this, was if you want to preserve your liberty and your democracy, if you live in a democracy, it requires eternal vigilance by the citizens. You can't depend on the government to do that. It takes the citizens watching and making sure that your freedoms and your liberties stay protected, and citizens have to act when that's threatened.
In addition to his teaching responsibilities, did your father engage in other sort of community activities?
Yeah, they did, both my mother and he, but in particular, my father, because of his background, almost always ended up as the sponsor of the International Students Club wherever we lived. So our house often had students there from all over the world, particularly often students from Africa. My father was a great correspondent. He exchanged letters with professors all over the world, particularly at places like Africa. And in fact, we still have this great stamp collection today because every time a letter would come in from Africa or parts of Asia and so forth, I would take the stamp off of the letter and add it to our stamp collection.
What did you learn from the students that stayed at your home or that you interacted with as a result of your dad's interest?
Well, I learned both from them and from my father. And look, my father treated everyone equally. You know, the kind of discrimination that was unfortunately going on in the South in the 50s and 60s did not happen in my household or in my father's classes, because he, as a Russian, as someone who'd lived in Europe in the 20s and 30s, he believed in judging people based on their character. He didn't care what color they were. He also didn't care what gender they were. You know, he came actually from a generation of 20s and 30s in Europe where women had a great deal of freedom, you know, to work and to write. And so I learned from him to try to treat people according to who they are, not based on their color or anything like that.
Did you take advantage of any exchange programs yourself?
I did, and that was probably the other big thing that really influenced me, particularly to become a conservative. When I was 16 years old, I was part of a student exchange program with Barranquilla, Colombia. Huntsville had a sister city in Colombia, and 5 students from the 5 high schools in Huntsville went down to Barranquilla to live with local families there, and they sent 5 students up to Huntsville. I spent 2 months there. It was a great experience, but boy, not only did I see corruption of the worst kind in government, I saw poverty in a way, abject poverty that we just don't see in America. And I was so glad to get back to the United States. When I came through the Miami airport, I almost felt like kneeling down and kissing the ground because I was back in the States. And that really brought home to me what I had learned from my parents about what a great country this is. And, you know, we've got our problems and we've made errors and mistakes, but this is a bastion of liberty and opportunity. And we've got to do everything we can to preserve that, not just for us, but for future generations.
So one of the things that I see sort of as a theme in your life up to the point where you come back from Colombia is this idea of people interacting to create this democracy, this republic
Yes.
that we live in. Did you ever hear any stories from your parents about the totalitarian regimes that they lived in and the ability to debate and exchange ideas in those countries.
Yeah, particularly for my father. Like I said, he was a very young man during the Russian Revolution. He actually was in the Russian army and fought in World War I on the German front until the communists came in and Russia quit fighting. But a lot of folks don't realize that before the communists took over, there was an attempt, in Russia to establish a democratic republic. That spectacularly failed when the communists took over. And I can remember my father saying to me that you can't have a civil debate with individuals about forming a democratic government if they are individuals who are not willing to debate you, but who would rather show up at your house in the middle of the night and kill you. And that's the way the communists operated. And that really made me realize that the long tradition we've had here of civil debate, it's very important to preserve that, because when individuals start engaging in violence, the way, for example, Antifa did last summer, that is extremely dangerous.
And I was going to ask, do you see a threat to that civil debate now more so than in other points in your life?
I do, and in particular, what I've seen is that the technology has made this worse, because the social media platforms now give the ability to intimidate and harass individuals, to basically force them out of their jobs, to affect them in their neighborhoods in a way that couldn't be done before. And the misuse of those social media platforms for that purpose, again, I think is very dangerous.
So let's fast forward a little bit. You graduate from college, you graduate from law school, you're practicing law in Atlanta, and you really get your first taste of electioneering, of elections.
Yeah, what happened was I had my arm twisted to become a poll watcher in a local county election. I didn't really want to do it, but I said, okay, I will volunteer to do it. And I ended up in a low-income housing neighborhood in a polling place in Atlanta. And I was astonished when I showed up at the polling place. It was a general election. I was astonished when I saw that the women who worked at the desk where voters check in, make sure they're registered and so forth, were asking certain voters when they came in, well, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Now, that's clearly, I thought, an attempt to intimidate those voters. This was an overwhelmingly Democratic precinct. They were only asking it of certain voters coming in. And it looked to me like coercion, intimidation. It was an improper question. I complained to the poll manager about this. He refused to do anything about it. So I actually called the county election department, this is Fulton County, Georgia, complained to them about it, and they actually, credit to them, they sent someone down there and told them to stop doing this because it was illegal. And that gave me a taste of the fact that, boy, even in the United States, we sometimes have problems in our elections.
So you go from a poll watcher and you move on to other responsibilities in Georgia.
Yeah, like a lot of states, elections in Georgia are run by a citizen board. It's not a full-time job. They appoint citizens, and I ended up on the 5-member board of registration elections that was responsible for registering voters and running the polls on election day in Fulton County, which at the time it was the largest county in the state. And that really got me the experience in the difficulties and problems of actually administering an election. And that was valuable experience. It also was the first time I started really seeing some of the problems that we have, some of the holes in the system. And that's what led me, for example, to recommend that really the state of Georgia needed a voter ID law so that when people showed up at the polls, they could authenticate they really were the registered voter.
You went from that practical experience to publishing. You're one of the most published authorities in America now, but even back then, you were publishing articles, testifying. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, my actual experience as an election administrator led me to write some papers for, at that time, the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. It was a think tank in Georgia, making recommendations on how to fix the system. Everything from the fact the state, I thought, needed a voter ID law to warning about the dangers of absentee or mail-in balloting and how it could be abused. And then remember after the 2000 election and the big problems in Florida, Congress, the big thing in Congress was election reform on a federal level. Committees of Congress started holding field hearings around the country, and I was invited to testify, both because of my actual experience for 5 years as an election administrator, plus the studies and recommendations I had published. I was asked to testify about what I thought ought to be done about this. That really got me ended up getting me into elections full time.
Interesting. At some point, did you leave the private practice of law and the part-time work in elections to jump into election law full-time?
Yeah, because remember in 2001 when the Bush administration started, as I said, Congress was really looking at election reform. It was all those field hearings that led to the Help America Vote Act that was passed in 2002. And so the Justice Department at the time wanted to hire a lawyer with some experience in the reform area. And I applied for the job, and I got hired at the Justice Department to keep track of election reform. And a lot of people mistakenly think I was a political appointee. I wasn't. I was actually hired as a career lawyer on that issue. And that got me to Washington. It got me full time into working on election reform.
And what kind of cases were you working on, and how did that work out? As I remembered, because I was at the Department of Justice around the same time frame, or actually a little bit before that, the Civil Rights Division was not the most conservative group of people.
No, they were extremely, the people who worked there, the career folks, were extremely unfriendly to me. And I couldn't quite figure it out until I basically discovered that this view of career lawyers at the Justice Department, particularly in the Civil Rights Division, as these objective, nonpartisan, almost lab scientists, is totally wrong. The career people I encountered were some of the most radical left-wing ideologues I've ever encountered, and they were extremely angry that someone with my particular views on election reform had actually gotten hired into the career ranks. And I encountered more hostility there than I've ever encountered in any other job I've ever held in my career.
Interesting. And at some point, did you get promoted in that group?
Yeah, I started off as a trial lawyer. I ended up getting promoted to be the counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, where I was actually coordinating enforcement of federal laws like the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act. And then after 4 years, George Bush actually nominated me to be a commissioner at the Federal Election Commission, where I served for 2 years enforcing federal campaign finance laws.
Great. So you move on to the Heritage Foundation, one of the esteemed foundations, think tanks in the country, and you lead their election integrity efforts.
Right.
And I understand from my work on the Hill about a database that you maintain there. Why don't you tell us about that database?
Sure. A couple of years ago, we started a database. I got so tired of hearing the mainstream press and others claim there's no election fraud in the United States when the U.S. unfortunately has a long history of it. So we started a database. It's a database of proven election fraud cases. And by proven, I mean we don't put in claims and allegations. We only put in cases where somebody's actually convicted in a court of law of fraud, or a judge or court orders a new election because of fraud, or there's an official finding by a state agency of fraud. It is not a comprehensive list. I don't have the resources to do that. It is a sampling of cases from across the country. We've got cases from almost every single state. We're up to over 1,300 proven cases. And I can tell you, it's now one of the most visited web pages at the Heritage Foundation.
And why is that so important to chronicle that kind of activity?
Because the cases all point out the vulnerabilities that we have in our current system. Look, we have every kind of fraud you can imagine in there. Everything from people who are not U.S. citizens registering and voting and getting away with it for years, to folks registering in more than one state and voting more than once in the same election, to absentee ballot fraud. And sometimes it's just one person stealing a ballot, but in other cases it's an organized effort, and sometimes it makes a difference. I mean, we put in a case not too long ago of a mayor of a small Alabama town, I think 2 years ago, who was convicted of voter fraud and thrown out of office because he was convicted of absentee ballot fraud in an election that he won by only a little more than a dozen votes. Or 2018, we had a congressional race overturned for the U.S. House, 9th Congressional District in North Carolina, again, because of absentee ballot fraud. And we had the same thing happen in 2020. We had a town council election overturned in Paterson, New Jersey, again, because of fraud. It can and does sometimes affect elections, and I think it's important that we keep it documented. Plus, it helps states, whereas the main work is done on elections and election laws. It'll help states fix the holes in their system so that we can do two things: make sure every American who's eligible is able to vote, but second, secure their vote to make sure it's not stolen or diluted by fraud.
And I was going to ask you, the one of the purposes of analyzing and accumulating information is to develop legislation.
That's right.
That moves forward. Have you seen that kind of development? Are the states concerned? And
yes.
Before 2020, were the states concerned and focused on this issue?
Before 2020, they were concerned about it. And in fact, we had good developments in states like over the past decade, in places like Indiana and Georgia, Texas, South Carolina, who did things like put in voter ID laws. But there's been that interest has really grown since last year's election. And we've had actually good election reform efforts in many states, everyone from Arizona to Iowa, again, Georgia, and other places, trying to fix some of these problems. And look, these days, this is looked at as a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. If you look at our database, there are Republicans in there who've committed fraud. There are Democrats who've committed fraud. And there are many cases where it's not one party committing fraud against the other party. And in some of the cases, it's people within the same party stealing from each other. And this used to not be a partisan issue. I really don't understand why it's become such a partisan issue. It shouldn't be one. It's something everybody ought to be concerned about.
Well, in 2016, President Trump wins, and
Right.
The Democrats are complaining that the Russians colluded and there needs to be a special counsel. In 2020, the president is complaining that the Democrats stole the election. It seems like both sides have some distrust and have created within their base a distrust. Why are voter ID laws so important?
Well, because just like anything else you do, like get on an airplane, you're supposed to authenticate your identity. And if you're not going to do that, then you can have all kinds of problems, and you can have people, trying to steal elections. So that's just a basic requirement. And by the way, it's one that the American people overwhelmingly support. This is a great voter ID is a great example of where the leadership, for example, of liberal organizations does not match what their constituents think, because the polling consistently shows that an overwhelming majority of Democrats, Republicans, Independents, whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics all think voter ID, well, yeah, of course, it's a common sense reform. So they don't oppose it. In fact, they want it, because what you talk to Americans, what they want is both access, but they also want security.
The idea that we have voter ID laws or other ways of guaranteeing the credibility of an election,
Right.
By some, they turn that and say what you're trying to do is suppress the vote. What's your response to that?
That is a myth. That is a theme created by those who want to oppose election reform. And the reason we know that is that, again, going back to voter ID, for example. Look, voter ID laws have been in place now for more than a decade. Georgia's law was for in-person voting, voter ID, was effective in the 2008 presidential election. Indiana's law was effective in 2008. We've got 10 years worth of data, turnout data, that shows that voter ID laws don't suppress anyone's vote. And in fact, you may have seen this. Kind of the Census Bureau, just released a report on last year's election, and we had the highest turnout in this century in a presidential election.
With the most voter ID laws ever in this country.
Exactly. So it's very clear this does not suppress votes. And the fact that it's also so overwhelmingly supported by Americans who want this kind of security shows you that this whole voter suppression idea is just nonsense.
You grow up with a fascinating kitchen table, learning about what happens in totalitarian regimes, learning about how cruel some humans can be to other humans.
Right.
You visit foreign countries, you see the desperation, the poverty, the government control over people, and you get excited about election integrity. Why are elections so important to a country that values freedom, that values the not just the prosperity, but the diversity, the inclusiveness, the beauty that we have here in America?
Look, the Bill of Rights is probably the greatest document ever written to preserve individual liberty and freedom. But all of those rights depend on free and fair elections. It's the ability to go vote, to know that your vote is not going to be stolen, that it's not going to be miscounted by the government. All of those other rights are dependent on free elections. And that's why, I do have a real passion for it, and that's why it is so important.
Great. So there's a question I ask all my guests, and that is, if loving this is wrong, I don't want to be right. Hans, what is this?
Well, if I can be a little less serious for a moment, my wife and I just love to ballroom dance.
Oh, interesting.
We love to swing dance. And if loving swing dancing is somehow wrong, then I don't want to be right. That's actually how we met, and we've kept it up for many years doing that, and we really enjoy it.
And then you ever compete? Is there any election integrity? There's a Russian judge who gives you a bad grade or something?
No, we don't compete, but we just really like doing that.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank Hans von Spakovsky for shooting straight with us, and I want to thank you for listening today. I hope this program has been informative, enlightening, and uniting. As Americans struggle with the difficult issues facing our country, we are reminded that good policy is the result of open, thoughtful discussion. For more straight shooting programs, go to my website, shootinstraightpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this show and have ideas about future topics or guests, shoot me an email, ken@shootinstraightpodcast.com. God bless you, and remember to shoot straight.